Here we are with a deep dive on the original, the 1968 Planet of the Apes, starring Charlton Heston. Now I have to give this caveat once again. This is a full spoiler discussion, and I do think it's really great if you can experience it the first time on your own. So if you haven't, I would recommend doing that, but regardless, here we go. The movie starts off with these 4 astronauts on a deep space mission. They left in 1972, but due to time dilation, 700 years have already passed on Earth. Their leader is Taylor, and the other astronauts have already gone into hypersleep, and Taylor is kind of giving this captain's log. He says that he's happy to be leaving Earth and humanity behind because they're kind of awful. He wonders if, after all this time passage, if future generations are any better, or if they're still just committing atrocities against one another. And the reason that this little introductory monologue is important is because of the context that was going on at the time the movie came out. Just to give a brief little overview, we had the civil rights movement, we had the Vietnam War, we had this debate for science versus religion, specifically, like if evolution would be taught in public schools, and we had the second Red Scare as well, with McCarthyism, and we'll get into that stuff a little bit later. So the astronauts wake up from hypersleep when they crash land in Lake Powell, Utah. No, just kidding. It was filmed in Utah, shout out Utah. But in the story, they've landed on an unknown planet. Unfortunately, the female astronaut Stewart had a leak in her hypersleep chamber. She's already dead. The boys aren't that torn up about it because they didn't want no girls on this trip anyway. Right before they escape the ship, Taylor gets one last look at the clock and sees that not just 700 years have passed on Earth, but 2,000 years. So the guys get to shore. One of the astronauts, Landon, plants this little American flag in the soil. And Taylor has this sort of laughing fit. It's kind of a little piece of goofy 60s cinema, but it's really setting the tone for Taylor's character and the perspective of this movie. It holds a lot of cynicism, like Taylor, towards humanity. You know, they're light years away from Earth, crazy far in the future. Everything that they've known is dust, it's gone. This other astronaut is clearly still clinging to a lot of these ideas, and Taylor thinks he's an idiot for that. He kind of berates him for it. You think any of those constructs, any of those ideas that you were holding on to are still around? Forget about it. The guys wander for a little bit, but eventually they find a race of people that look like humans, only primitive. And the humans start scattering like deer or something. And the guys realize that all the humans are being hunted. But by what? If you guess apes, you'd be correct. If you guessed apes on horses, you'd be double correct. If you're thinking the makeup looks a little goofy by today's standards, I get it. But what you've got to realize is that this makeup, these prosthetics, these were revolutionary at the time. And the man responsible for all that is this guy named John Chambers. So before coming to Hollywood, John Chambers was a medical technician in World War II, and he designed prosthetic limbs for soldiers. You can see how maybe the skills kind of carried over. He's also famous for designing Spock's pointy ears in the original Star Trek show. So before this movie came along, there was not an Academy Award for makeup. But guess who won the first one? John Chambers. So back to the story. In the chaos of the hunt, Taylor gets separated from Landon. We don't really know what happens to him yet. But he does see Dodge meet an untimely end. I do have a few thoughts on that, but we're going to come back to it. Taylor is also injured in the throat, which makes it so that he can no longer talk. He's rounded up with a bunch of other humans, put in a cage, and taken to the Ape City. Now, if you're thinking this Ape City looks a little primitive, well, there's a reason for that, and that reason is studio budget. See, the movie Planet of the Apes is based on a French novel by writer Pierre Boulle. Now, in his original novel, the ape society is actually just as advanced as modern day society, if not even a little bit more advanced. And in the early drafts for the script, that element was kept. The ape society was supposed to be modern. The budget was getting up to be around $10 million, and that's in 1960s money. And the studio wanted it to be closer to $5 million. So for later drafts of the script, the studio brings in Michael Wilson. So one of the big changes he makes from earlier drafts of the script is to make the apes a more primitive society. He also has some other major contributions, but we'll come back to that. Even though it's not like a modern advanced society, I actually think it has a really interesting look. The art director, William Krieber, and his team used wood, cardboard, and polyurethane foam. And at the time, it was kind of an innovative design. So innovative that a few years later, reading some article about a prestigious university that had developed this ability to build structures with the foam, it was like, we already did that for the Apes movie a few years back. So, kind of funny. So back to the story. Taylor's being kept in a cage with a bunch of other primitive humans, and he's starting to learn that the apes view humans as animals, or even worse, as vermin. Ape scientists are studying the humans, and they're performing experiments on them that include dissection and experimental brain surgery, so it's not looking good. And as Taylor observes the ape society, he starts to realize that there's a social hierarchy. Gorillas are the military force and the laborers. Chimpanzees are the doctors and scientists, and orangutans hold the most power as political and religious leaders. Now, if you're noticing that the apes with lighter features seem to hold more power than the apes with darker features, well, then you're probably onto something. Which brings us back to Rod Serling. Now, I talked a little bit about Serling's contributions in my other video, but we're going to dive just a little bit deeper. Some of it will be repeat information. Serling wrote the early drafts of the Planet of the Apes scripts, and Serling operated in science fiction, but he was really interested in tackling a lot of social, political, cultural themes. The problem was that he was writing in the time of the Hays Code. Now, this was Hollywood's way of self-policing, but it was way more involved with censorship than anything that we have today. Violence or sexuality, but also cultural, social, political topics that they deemed were too controversial. For a really long time, Serling was trying to get a script made that was about Emmett Till. Eventually, some version of it got to the screen, but it had been hacked to pieces and no longer resembled the story that Serling wanted to tell. So that's why he turns to The Twilight Zone, which is often sci-fi stories, and he's quoted as saying, "A Martian can say things a Republican or a Democrat never could." So he uses science fiction to get around the censors and talk about the things that he really wants to talk about. And if you're wondering, wouldn't the producers and network executives and the censors realize his little trick? And the answer is no. In one of the behind-the-scenes documentaries for Planet of the Apes, they interviewed Richard Zanuck, who was a very prolific producer at the time. And I put a quote up here: "We weren't making an esoteric picture with deep meanings and whatever. We were making an adventure film. We were making an entertaining picture." So a lot of these ideas that clearly Planet of the Apes is talking about really did kind of slip by because the story seemed to be talking about apes and not our own society. So back to the story. Over time, even though Taylor can't talk due to his throat injury, he's able to convince two of the ape scientists, Zira and Cornelius, that he is an intelligent human. And Zira starts to get really excited because her and Cornelius have already developed theories that apes may have evolved from humans, or at the very least, a human civilization might have lived on this planet before the apes. And Taylor could be evidence of their theories as a missing link. Now, even though Cornelius is the one that found the evidence and came up with these theories, he's terrified of presenting these findings or of, "Hey, no sneezing!" because in ape society it would be considered blasphemy. See, the apes, led by the orangutans, have scripture, they have sacred scrolls, and these theories would contradict what the scrolls say. He warns Zira that they need to be really careful about this or it could be life or death consequences for them. Now, despite the risk, Zira believes that if the orangutans are confronted with evidence as strong as somebody like Taylor, they wouldn't be able to deny the theories. So she starts to cautiously introduce that evidence to one of the head orangutans, Dr. Zayas. Now the crazy thing is that Dr. Zayas clearly sees the evidence that Taylor is unique, but he just repeatedly denies it, finds an excuse. Zayas is so threatened by Taylor that he actually orders other ape scientists to perform surgery on Taylor without Zira and Cornelius knowing. So Taylor escapes and he's running all over the ape city. So at one point during this escape, Taylor finds himself in a museum, and it's really eerie because a lot of primitive humans are in the museum as exhibits. They've been taxidermied and they're set up kind of like we do with animals in natural history museums. But then he sees something that really shocks him. Dodge, the astronaut that was killed in the hunt earlier, is now one of those taxidermied humans. Now, I said earlier I was going to come back to the character of Dodge. Now, I was kind of surprised. In the research I did online, there wasn't a lot of information about the potential themes or symbolism about Dodge's character. So obviously, as we've kind of covered, this movie is dealing with themes of discrimination, racism, and we have Dodge, who's the only black astronaut, and he's unceremoniously, brutally killed early in the movie, only to return halfway in the movie with his body being displayed in this kind of grotesque way. And I wasn't able to find a lot of great screenshots for it, but even earlier in the movie, before they encounter the apes, there's several shots where Dodge seems kind of separate from Taylor and Landon. And there's one shot in particular where Taylor and Landon are debating. Dodge is walking in the foreground, but super far ahead of them. He's almost like a dot on the horizon. Now, as many of you might know, Hollywood's history with representation isn't great. It's why we have tropes, like the idea that the first person to die in a horror movie is always the black token character. And the only reason that this movie avoids that trope is because even earlier than Dodge dying, they had the female character die before she could even have any lines. It just seems like there's no way that all of that was by accident. It does get a little dicey wondering what exactly they were saying. I think they could have been saying all kinds of things about marginalization and the way that women or minorities have been portrayed in film. But at the end of the day, these characters did have an early exit from the movie and weren't represented. So it's more of an interesting thing to mull over. I would love to hear if you guys have any ideas. Okay, so back to the story. He's captured by the apes again, and we have the famous line,
"Take your stinking paws off me, you damn dirty ape!"
So Taylor's voice has miraculously returned and he speaks in front of all these apes. So the evidence can no longer be denied that he is clearly special. Once hearing this, the orangutans decide to have a trial about what to do with Taylor. judge, jury, executioner are, of course, the orangutans. It soon becomes clear that Taylor is not only on trial, but Zira and Cornelius as well. And at that point, Taylor decides to step in and defend himself. And they don't respect him at all. At one point, they even say his clothes stink and order them to be removed, so he's literally standing naked before the court. Now, I said we were going to come back to Michael Wilson. He had a huge hand in influencing these trial scenes. And the reason why is because Michael Wilson himself was questioned by the House Un-American Activities Committee. Now, this committee launched a very public campaign to try to root out and expose anybody who were deemed as communist sympathizers. So most people that were questioned by the committee from Hollywood just refused to answer because they believed their rights were being violated. To them, even if they did have communist views, that wasn't illegal, and they shouldn't have been questioned. So the result for a lot of these Hollywood people was that they were blacklisted. Now, what that meant for a lot of people is not that they didn't get to work in Hollywood anymore, but just that Hollywood wouldn't credit them. For instance, Michael Wilson continued to write several movies under the table, uncredited. One of them being The Bridge on the River Kwai, which, if you'll remember, was written by Pierre Boulle, who wrote the books for both Planet of the Apes and Bridge on the River Kwai. And the credit on screen goes to Pierre Boulle, which is impossible because that guy doesn't even speak English. So with that background and watching those trial scenes, you can see how much he infused his experience into it, and it's really interesting. So once the trial concludes, it looks like Taylor's going to be disposed of, and frankly, it's not looking good for Zira and Cornelius either. So everyone decides to escape the Ape City. And toward the end of the movie, we get to this point where all the characters find themselves in that cave that Cornelius found earlier, where all the artifacts exist of this possible previous civilization. In there, Taylor, Zira, and Cornelius present Dr. Zaius with all the evidences of this past human civilization. Because Taylor's human, he's able to pick some of them out. There's old eyeglasses, there's dentures, but the most incriminating is a human doll. Nova's playing with the doll and she manages to activate the doll's old voice box and it says mama. It can't be denied. Why would apes make a human doll that talks? Or this had to have been a human civilization. Taylor then takes a little bit of a victory lap. We see him sort of walking back on the perspective that he had at the beginning of the movie.
He was a weak, fragile animal. But he was here before you. And he was better than you are.
He finally has a little bit of pride in humans after witnessing this upside down civilization, as he calls it. So once they leave the cave, Dr. Zaius' troops have surrounded the whole area, so Taylor kind of has to take him hostage to be able to escape. None of the evidence was surprising to Dr. Zaius. He already knew about humans. He has Cornelius reach into his pocket and read one of the sacred scrolls.
Beware the beast man, for he is the devil's pawn. Alone among God's primates, he kills for sport, or lust, or greed. Yea, he will murder his brother to possess his brother's land. Let him not breed in great numbers, for he will make a desert of his home and yours. Shun him. Drive him back into his jungle lair, for he is the harbinger of death.
Even though Zaius' power base definitely comes from the religion, and he's probably protecting himself, he also has interesting motivations in that he seems to be genuinely concerned about ape society and seeing the coming of Taylor as a possible threat to the entire ape civilization. So Taylor's able to negotiate his freedom with Zaius as a hostage. He takes Nova and some supplies and a horse and just heads off down the beach. Until we get to the last scene of the movie. Taylor's going along the beach and we have the iconic ending, the last scene of the movie, which is him finding the Statue of Liberty buried in sand, and he realizes that he's not on some unknown planet. He's been on Earth all along, just 2,000 years into the future. So whatever pride Taylor was feeling about humanity toward the end of the movie is now gone. Humans annihilated themselves, and all that humans are and were is now just been passed down into their successors. So everything that Taylor was seeing that he felt was so crazy and upside down is just a reflection of what was already going on in the world that he left. We had racial strife, we had war, we had debates between religious dogma and scientific evidence. We had governments violating rights in formal trials. And in the society that Taylor thought was so backwards and worse than humans, he finds the exact same things. He finds a social hierarchy based on racial discrimination. He finds scientific evidence being destroyed on behalf of religious beliefs. He finds his and other people's rights being destroyed in official trials. And he finds the results of war. So it is kind of a devastating twist ending, very reminiscent of a lot of those Twilight Zone episodes. And it's tempting to view it as just really cynical and really pessimistic, but I like to view it more as a cautionary tale, a legend, a fairy tale, a myth on the things that society needs to fix now, lest we end up in some way like this, just repeating ourselves for eternity, even in a species that's not our own. Anyway, that's all I have for today. I skipped over plenty of details. There's plenty more to discuss about this movie and a lot of the other movies in the franchise. Happy to keep doing that or discuss in the comments, whatever people want to do. I have seen Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. I really enjoyed it. I thought there was a lot to chew on. I will probably do a video with some thoughts on that, but I would love to know what you think about this movie or Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes or whatever. So feel free to reach out in comments or DMs or whatever you want to do. And thanks for being here.